Good afternoon. My name is Leo Casey. I am the Executive Director of the Albert Schenker Institute, and we are very pleased and proud today to be hosting this conversation of the very important book written by Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider, Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of the School. This is a book, as the title suggests, on the campaign to undermine public education in the United States and why, if it is successful, it will be harmful to American society, to American democracy, which just survived a near-death experience and remains in danger, and to diminishing the economic inequality and collapse of economic opportunity that has defined the last 3 decades. This campaign is a live issue today as we are witnessing an effort fueled by many from the Koch brothers and others that has been invested in AstroTurf organizations to take advantage of the struggles to reopen schools and restart in-person learning while securing the health and safety of the people in those schools. I suspect that our panelists today may want to discuss that effort and the challenges of simultaneously advancing 2 absolutely crucial goods, the safety of people in schools and the importance of in-person education. Let me introduce the panelists, starting with the authors, Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. Jennifer is a journalist extraordinaire who has written about education and politics in the New York Times, the New Republic, The Nation, and other publications. She teaches courses in journalism at Boston College and University of Massachusetts Amherst Labor Studies program. She is the author of a book on John Dunlap, a labor economist who served in several positions in the federal government, including Secretary of Labor, and helped found the field of labor studies. And if Amazon tells the truth, and Amazon always tells the truth, this book is scheduled for publication in the middle of this month. Did Amazon tell the truth, Jennifer?
No, they did not. That book has been out for a while, but it's been read by so few people that it awaits rediscovery.
Amazon told me it would when it was published on February 15th, I could read. Jack is an assistant professor of education at University of Massachusetts at Lowell, where he heads the Beyond the Test Scores project. He is the author of 4 books on the history of different facets of education policy, and he has been published in The Atlantic, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He is a founder of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment. Jennifer and Jack are co-hosts of the lively education podcast, Have You Heard?, which I recommend to our audience. It is always a delight to hear Jennifer and Jack tease each other as they take us through a discussion of educational issues of the moment. Jennifer and Jack wanted this discussion of their book to be a genuine dialogue, not an echo of the same point of view. And so we invited Andy Smarick to join us today. Andy sits on the Maryland Higher Education Commission, a position that he was nominated for by the current Governor Larry Hogan. He is currently a senior fellow of the Conservative Manhattan Institute, and he has previously been a fellow of the R Street Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, sometimes better known as AEI. He was a domestic policy aide in the George W. Bush White House, a deputy assistant secretary in the U.S. Department of Education, and the deputy commissioner of education in the state of New Jersey. Before I turn the floor over to Jennifer, Jack, and Andy, I need to make 3 housekeeping announcements. First, the AFT Executive Council is meeting as I speak and discussing the crucial issue of how to reopen schools safely, so I will not be able to remain for the entire discussion. It is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on the Schenker Institute website, and I will be one of those people doing the later viewing. My colleague Esther Quintero will fill in for me in the roles I would normally do in the rest of the session. Second, we will post in the chat a link where you can purchase Jennifer and Jack's book at a discount, if I'm not mistaken. I am mistaken. All sorts of misinformation today. Lastly, we invite your participation. And after Jennifer, Jack, and Andy engage in a dialogue, we will take questions from the audience to pose to the three of them. You can submit your question in the Q&A function, which appears at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. Without any further ado, let me turn the floor over to Andy Smarick.
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And I should say at the beginning, I speak only as myself, not for this state position that I'm on. So attribute all madness just to me alone. So thank you to Leo and the Albert Shanker Institute. I'm excited about this event. And I want to say thanks to Jennifer and Jack for writing such an interesting book. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to ask lots of questions and raise various types of concerns. I can't help it. I'm just hardwired to be difficult. So forgive me, please. But I do want to underscore before all of that just how interesting I thought this book was and how it made me think anew about a number of subjects and how it made me go back to some first principles on others, which is always a good sign of a book. And it ultimately raises what I think is maybe the most important, or certainly among the most important questions facing policymakers, which is how do we balance institutional change, which is necessary, with institutional preservation, which is valuable? And along those lines, and this is my thesis, is that Jennifer and Jack have written what might be the most conservative education book I've read in ages. So conservatism is ultimately about conserving. It's about protecting the institutions that have been handed down to us over time. Conservatives believe that there are continuities in the human condition. So practices and organizations that have stood the test of time are probably evolutionarily robust. They contain wisdom. They solve unavoidable problems. They address perpetual needs. So this is why conservatives generally will be found trying to defend stable, longstanding institutions, habits, ways of life. It's also why conservatives end up finding themselves at odds with strident reformers who want to unmake what has been made or to dismantle with the established ways of doing things. And so A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door is part of this venerable conservative tradition. It stands athwart history yelling stop. It is committed to preserving the traditional approach to the delivery of public education, and it is frustrated, often deeply, at those who the authors think are trying to undermine or dismantle that way of delivering public education. Now, I'm a conservative, as you probably know from my introduction, and I'm a conservative through and through. So there are a bunch of things in this book that resonated with me. I'm skeptical of the ability of for-profits to run great schools at scale. I like the ideas behind hyper-local, democratically legitimate units of government running important parts of collective life. I've never been crazy about the idea of massive disruption brought about by online learning. I think unbundling could potentially go too far, and I certainly don't want to turn the teaching profession into some sort of gig-style profession. I think there are dangers to that. But while I'm conservative, I have also spent a chunk of my career trying to reform public education, and I get my bearings on this from Edmund Burke, who has multiple lines along the lines of, essentially, if you want to preserve something in the long term, you have to find ways of changing it. To change is essential, ultimately, to the things that should last in perpetuity. So to be upfront, I do actually like a bunch of the reforms that Jack and Jennifer do not, the ones that they criticize. But along those lines, the book has made me think about this tension between when is it right, or how is it right to think about preserving things that you also know need to go about being changed. So being a guy of the right, I often find myself in this position of trying to defend longstanding institutions against those who want to alter them. So I've had to develop over time some productive approach to engaging in discussions along these lines, whether I'm talking about keeping courts restrained or in defense of pluralism or federalism or any other kind of institution. I have found that I just can't put my fingers in my ears and scream, keep everything the same. Everyone who wants to change is evil. I have learned the hard way that that's not helpful. That doesn't get me very far. So I've tried to develop this way of what I call 2 do's and 1 don't about thinking about this tension between change and preservation that help me think about this book. So here they are. 1, do, as you're entering these discussions, do always define the institution that you were trying to protect. What exactly is it? What exactly are its features? Number 2, do always try to explain what its essential features are that are worth preserving. Like, what is the principle behind each of its pieces that we ought to defend? And the last thing is the don't. Don't just dismiss out of hand any criticism that comes at a institution that you like. No institution is perfect. They are human ultimately, and humans are flawed and times change. So maybe the reformers have something right. So at minimum, we should try to understand reformers and the reforms as they understand them. And this approach generally has led me to have a better way of thinking about what I'm trying to conserve and its different pieces, what they're contributing. And maybe more importantly, it's given me a better way of when a reform or a reformer comes and says, let's do things differently, I have a better way of noticing, well, is that the kind of thing that scratches the same itch that I have, that achieves the same goal, even if it does it in a different way? Heck, maybe it's a better way. So when I apply that model to this book, here's what ends up popping out for me as a guy of the right. On the first do, about clearly defining the institution that you're trying to protect. I've gone through the book twice now, and I'm still, unfortunately, not totally clear what the authors honestly believe the proper form of public education delivery is. The book moves very quickly into the dismantlers, and I wish that it actually spent a bunch of time on precisely discussing what the dismantlers are trying to dismantle. So, for example, I don't know if the authors believe that there should be no private schools in America, or maybe they think there should be some, but only people with money should have access to them. I don't know if the authors think that some nonprofits could run schools in the public sector, or if they all need to be run by a district. I'm not sure if the authors think that all schools need to be, public schools need to be enrolled via residential-based assignments, or if some school choice is good in their book. I don't know what their view on the state's role vis-a-vis districts is. And I'm not asking these rhetorical questions or just to provoke. I genuinely don't know the answers to those questions. And so my view is, before talking about dismantling, it would be helpful to know what is the thing that we have in front of us and that we're trying to preserve. So on the second do, about what are the essential features and the principles behind them. Again, I'm not totally sure always what the principle is that the authors would like policymakers who are reading the book to leave with. So if you look through the book, and you really ought to, it has these great chapters that focus on a particular domain of public policy. And Jack and Jennifer do a very good job of outlining the things reformers have done that the authors, don't like. And it's areas related to accountability and advertising and virtual learning and for-profits and cost cutting and unbundling. All of these are worthwhile conversations. But I don't know, after having read the book, if the authors think that all cost cutting is bad, or if all advertising and unbundling is bad, or if is all virtual learning bad, or all deregulation, is that bad, or accountability systems? So I was left wondering throughout the book, what is the principle that the authors would be handing to a policymaker who had to make a decision? So let me put a fine point on this so this just isn't too abstract. If a district were to go before a state board of education and say, will you please cut the regulations related to high school graduation that make us do all these standardized tests? Or will you please cut the regulations related to who can drive a school bus? We're having trouble finding the people and we need a bigger universe. Or will you please cut the regulations related to who can coach the swim team? Are those examples of dismantling public education because they're deregulation? If a rural community really wants its families to have more access to automotive repair or AP calculus or physics, and the only way to get it is through a private online provider, would that constitute dismantling public education? If a district uses a for-profit to get its textbooks, or to deliver its lunches, or to lead its CEO superintendent search, or a for-profit to lead technical assistance or professional development for teachers. Are all of those instances of dismantling public education? Again, these aren't rhetorical questions. I don't know where the authors land on those, or if they have differences of opinion. So it's hard for me to know which reforms are in bounds or out of bounds. Like, what is the rule of thumb that we ought to use? So lastly, on the don't, about don't dismiss out of hand criticisms of institutions that we love. As a conservative, I have to deal with this all the time, like just not be jealous about the things I love and just push off everyone who's trying to change it. I just wish that the authors had given a bit more benefit of the doubt to the reformers who've been trying out of the best of intentions to make public education better. I worry that some good-hearted people could read this book and finish and think that the reform community is nothing but a bunch of crooks trying to make money, lacking civic virtue. All of the reformers that I know, or most of them who've been involved in this business, really want to help kids and communities. They would probably articulate their motivation along the lines of, for 50, 60 years, we've spent hundreds of billions of extra dollars on public education. The system is generally a unionized government monopoly in localities. And yet, despite all of that, student performance, especially in reading, has been stagnant. And low-income kids and other disadvantaged kids continue to perform way behind others. And we're increasingly not competitive with some of our closest international peers. Heck, we needed a big reform movement of deregulation and differentiation and accountability and flexibility to make the changes necessary. Now, you may not agree with all of that formulation, but I at least think that to take seriously why those people were doing those things and how their reforms are matched up in their minds with the problems they see is a good way to start this. So I've gone on too long, but if I had to condense all of these thoughts into a single sentence to get a conversation going, it would be, honestly, what do the authors see as the legitimate, good, proper system of public education? What are its features? And therefore, what are the legitimate forms of reforms that we can take on? And therefore, what are the illegitimate forms? So let me just stop there and say thank you again and hand it over, I don't know, to Jack or Jennifer or to both.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. I'll kick it off. Jennifer and I were surreptitiously texting each other to figure out how we would handle that. So first, thanks for the careful reading of the book and for providing some grist for the intellectual mill here. Jennifer and I love when we talk with people who, are predisposed to just cheerlead. That can be really fun. But we were really interested in a little pushback here because certainly there are going to be lots of people who read the book or who don't read the book precisely because they don't agree with us, right? Or at best will read it so that they can, mark up in the margins all the things that they hate about it, rather than thinking through, well, what are the things that this might challenge us to think more deeply about? So thank you again for that. I wrote a lot of notes that I didn't expect to write. And so I'm going to just sort of bounce around for a second, dive into your question, and then abruptly stop and turn it over to Jennifer. One thing that I want to address from the beginning is this notion of it being a deeply conservative book. And I might tweak the language slightly there, but I think you're right. And I'm recalling a conversation, a really formative conversation for me that I had with David Tyack back when I was in graduate school. And David said that he wanted to write a piece about a conservation ethic in public education. And I really didn't understand it. I was still too green. I still didn't really understand his motivation for that. And he died before I got it. And my getting it had to do not only with my, spending, the last, 15 years studying this stuff, but also actually reading a lot of the authors who he borrowed that phrasing from. So reading people like Aldo Leopold. And I think that this idea of protecting what is good in public education is really essential, especially because so much of what we talk about is what is wrong, right? We take so much for granted about this system that the reform ethos is really the dominant ethos, right? To identify every flaw in this system, and in fact, to identify lots of flaws that actually aren't flaws in the public education system, but rather flaws in an imaginary system that we've constructed because we've heaped so many of our hopes and dreams onto the public education system that it couldn't possibly bear. And so with reform, I'm looking at my notes here to try to move on from this point, but I just wanted to say, like, this idea that reform is sort of the only rhetoric we've got in education, I think has really made the institution vulnerable. It's opened the door for reforms that I think are possibly not well intended and not coming from a constructive place. And so I agree with you that a lot of people who are engaged in this work are coming at it from a perspective of really deeply wanting to improve the system for kids and drawing on their own personal experiences. But I think that those people have also laid the groundwork for people who have different kinds of intentions, which start with ideological principles rather than with an effort to solve problems. I'm going to sort of skip all the other stuff I had in my notes here and just say, one thing in response to the question there, and then turn it over to Jennifer. And that is, well, it's really four things, but the one thing that is four things is where I stand on what are the values at the heart of this, because one thing that Jennifer and I have really found useful that we got as a piece of feedback was early on in the manuscript. A colleague of mine said, but wait a minute, I'm a dismantler, right? He's a progressive educator. And he said, I want to pull this system apart. But what he clarified, and which we tried to insert into the book, and, it's like kind of an add-on at the end, was there are values that we want to preserve. There are principles that we want to preserve and elevate, and they haven't always been there, but they've increasingly been there over time. And then there's a lot that's really deeply problematic, and that's the stuff that people like Jennifer and I also want to pull apart, right? We don't want to keep it as it is, but we want to keep this basic framework. And I would say the idea that we are constantly creating a public in public education, right? Which I would say also requires us to fully integrate our schools. This idea that we are oriented around the public good and making the society that we want to live in through our public schools, right? That it's not just about human capital, that profit is not the motivation here. And that there are various ways of exercising citizenship through our public schools, from the hyper-local all the way through the national. Jennifer's giving me the look. She knows I could go on and on. I'm just going to abruptly stop and turn things over to her there.
Well, thank you, Jack. So Andy Smarick and I have been sparring for almost a decade now, which seems kind of hard to believe. And when we would interact online, he would refer to me as a traditionalist, and which used to just drive me crazy. I would be like, and what he meant by that was that I was wedded to a very, a particular notion of how schools should be governed, how education should be delivered, right? And so we fast forward to today, and as you described the book as conservative, it's funny. I'm okay with that. I'm willing to own that, and there are a couple of reasons. And one is the extraordinary times that we're living through right now, where we've just seen really up close that people who call themselves conservatives seem so willing to rip up what we think are foundational institutions by their roots. And I would include in that public education. When I try to describe to my friends who are not obsessed with education or don't follow state politics closely, the kinds of sweeping proposals that are now before legislators in states like New Hampshire and Florida and Arizona, where the goal isn't just to reform schools as you've been describing it, or even to allow more students to attend private schools. It's to untether education from place, right? And so when I describe to them the idea of something like an edu debit card that would come preloaded with some portion of state school spending dollars. And then it would be up to individual parents to decide how exactly they want to spend that money, and that the definition of a learning option is actually really vast, and that the programs tend to be unregulated and a kind of black box by design. They think I'm joking, right? Because this is such radical stuff. So how did we get here where I'm a conservative when, as you know, I'm really another AOC? And people who call themselves conservative now seem very willing to part ways with what has, what I understand to be an institution that is really inseparable from democracy. And I want to just give a brief shout out to our friend Derek Black, who has an incredible book out called Schoolhouse Burning that really traces the origins of public education and how it's been woven through our history and the history of democracy. So I just wanted to lead with that. And then Andy, I want to finish off. I came across this fantastic quote in the last couple of weeks, and I think it really gets to one of the questions that you raised, and I'm going to read it to you because I don't want to get anything wrong. I believe that in education and in other domains of public life, if we overstate a problem, we risk inviting radical, unfit public leaders who push radical, unfitting policy interventions. I read that and I said, "Oh, this is so great. I can't believe Andy Smarick wrote that." Back to you, sir.
Well, that's right. That is something that I wrote, and it was in response to exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about, which is, so I'm a conservative who believes both in the content of American conservatism and the temperament or the comportment of American conservatism. So I generally like localism, federalism, restrained courts, all that stuff. But I also believe that change ought to happen locally and gradually, and that one should keep one's head about oneself, because if you don't, like, this is, the ultimate case of the French Revolution. You talk too much about how bad things are, all of a sudden, if you're talking crisis all the time, crisis leaders emerge. And crisis leaders are not moderate in temperament. So there is a segment of the right who, and I've been reading recently about this, and this goes back quite some time, that is answering a longstanding conservative question. And the question goes like this. A conservative typically wants to conserve the institutions and the practices and habits that are around him or her, except when the zeitgeist over a certain period of time has completely revolutionized our patrimony. The good things that have been passed down to us have been so corrupted by recent events that to conserve what you have right now is to perpetuate errors. So some conservatives say, no, you need to be a revolutionary in the moment and get rid of the bad stuff right now, because we need to get back to the stuff that really conservatives believe in, because of progressive forces of the moment have done away with all that stuff. And this is sort of the core of some intra-conservative debates, which is, do we need to conserve and lay low and play slow and keep our heads about us, or is now the moment to be revolutionary, to fight, to recover all the things that have that the left or just generally progressive changes have changed? And I'm generally, like I said, a comportment conservative in addition to these other things. So I slow play things when there are lots and lots of other conservatives who are of the mindset, things have gone so off the rails, we need to stop being slow, we need to be dramatic. And that's what that sentence was all about.
Well, I just wanted to compliment you on that sentence. I really liked it. And I'm going to respond and then go back to one of the specifics that you asked about, because I think it's nice to be able to kind of skip between these high levels of abstraction and then take them back to these very specific policy debates, because that's kind of what you were asking us, right? So as a writer pre-pandemic, I've had the good fortune to get to do extensive amounts of traveling to the heartland, which is where I'm from. And I don't know if you remember, but James Fallows had this great piece a few years ago. And he said, he and his wife had traveled all around to these small towns. And he said, if you want your faith restored in Americans, go to a small town and visit a school. And the reason is that, he found, as I have found, that people cannot wait to show off their school.
Yes.
And the reason I raise this is because part of what I've been trying to chronicle is what I see as a huge gulf between Republican education policy and the interests of their constituents. And nowhere is this more clear than in rural areas where schools are absolutely foundational to community life, not just in terms of identity, but in terms of, they're the largest employer, they're the space, the only public space where people gather. And the reason that I mention this is because you raised as an example, okay, take this rural school, they want to offer auto repair, but the only way they can do that is through an online for-profit provider or something like that, right? Would you all be opposed to that? And I think, your point in raising that is to ask, like, oh, come on, are you really, like, are you so insistent that this is a wolf, that, you're not going to let these kids learn auto repair? And so what I've really come to understand as I've traveled through places like Michigan and Wisconsin is that it's a policy decision that those kids no longer have access to auto repair. And people in those communities are very unhappy about it, right? That their vision for what schools should do is so much bigger, so much richer than the policies that are coming down in their community. And yet really the fundamental divide of our time is that, they seem willing to continue to elect people who then go into office and are busy right now, right, trying to enact sweeping voucher legislation. So I raise this, I think that we approach these specific policies trying to think about always, Jack brings the history. Where did this come from? Like, where was it originally designed to do? At what point did we start to see people jump on a policy bandwagon because maybe they had a more ideological vision? And what does it mean as it's being rolled out now? So I'm going to hand it back to you, Jack.
Yeah, I think that's a nice place for me to pick up, because the thing I continue making notes to myself here. The thing that I'm just making notes about is the fact that this movement to unmake public education is not really playing it straight. That, when they come forward and lay out their values and their principles, rather than masking it in rhetoric, rather than, presenting a crisis and then framing their policies as responsive rather than ideologically driven. I think that's in bad faith. I think that that's a shift from something that we saw in the 80s, where Reagan was pretty upfront about his interest in vouchers, his faith in markets, his distaste for labor, and lost on that effort in public education, basically gave up on it because he realized that the public was not particularly interested in that. Whereas I think the public is broadly interested in a set of principles that are really at the heart of, I think what we would fight to preserve, and I think what lots of others would fight to preserve, right? That it's inclusive and always falls short of these things, right? And that's the part that we should really be working on to realize these values fully, right? That it's inclusive, that it's equitable, that it's broad in mission. These are things that we've seen, slippage on. And think about the breadth of the mission that has really been reduced over the past couple of decades as schools have been framed as engines for human capital production, that it's public-minded, that it's democratically operated. These are values that I think if you start with, you then can have a good faith conversation about how to advance those values through policy, as opposed to saying, no, we have a different set of values. These values are a deep faith in markets and an antagonism towards democratic politics, an ideological orientation towards cost cutting, regardless of the sort of pragmatic aspects of it, an ideological orientation to make war on organized labor, an elevation of private values over public values. And so I think that one of the things that is going to be really important in pushing back against this is to lay bare the fact that there is a coherent, cohesive ideology that undergirds a set of policies that otherwise look pretty haphazard and can be very difficult to understand. Why are some of these actors supporting things that otherwise don't really seem to go together? It's because they're being driven by ideology rather than a desire to solve problems, right? This is not pragmatism. This is not reform. This is a totally radical effort to upend an institution. And that radicalism has really actually been normalized in a lot of ways, right? This radical rhetoric about schools has been normalized by people both on the left and the right over the past few decades, right? We can track the crisis rhetoric in public education since the 80s, right? Since At Least a Nation at Risk. And there's interesting scholarship. I'll raise my hand as the author of some of it that tracks this crisis rhetoric through, various presidents like George H.W. Bush, who was the first to declare himself an education president, and using this as, essentially political leverage. We can see it play out in the Phi Delta Kappan poll every year, where people have basically no faith at all in the nation's schools, but pretty strong confidence in their own local schools.
That's right. So I want to agree with most of that, but then maybe at the end I draw a different conclusion, which is one reason that I do so much like inside the government public service is I have found that there is nothing that makes me happier and more content and more optimistic than actually being with real people doing the real work. I find the more I'm dealing with abstract matters, especially on the funhouse mirror of the world, Twitter, if I'm doing stuff with real people, I notice how good they are, how hard they're trying, and all of these institutions that lots of people say are busted really are not that busted. I mean, every time I was I was on the Maryland State Board of Education for 4 years. Every time I was in one of those meetings, like Donald Trump's name never came up, like maybe once a year. And it was about, okay, maybe the administration wanted us to do X or Y and we had to write a new regulation. But in general, the closer you get to the people and the activity, the practitioners, the more optimistic I just became, because it's real people, not grandstanding, they're just doing stuff. And that is part of what led to the quote that Jennifer read, which is, calm down a bit. Things are always kind of bad, but they're not so bad that we need to be alarmist about them. Now,
do you want me to reread it?
Actually, if you could like type it and hang it on your wall, even better for posterity. The point of this is, I mean, it goes back ages. Like, and some people even said a version of this related to A Nation at Risk, the 1983 report, which is some people accuse A Nation at Risk of catastrophizing American public education in the name of bringing about dramatic reform. And we've seen this in revolutionaries in America and elsewhere. The more you say bad stuff about the institution, the more willing people are to do dramatic stuff to change it. Okay. So in general, I think things are better than a lot of the revolutionaries of today are. But that doesn't mean things are great or they have always been great. Like, as a Catholic, like, one thing that is meaningful to me, and this is 100 years before I was born, but recent Catholic immigrants in the late 19th century and their bishops were so alarmed at the state of public schools that, the Baltimore Plenary of 1884 or 1888, they were like, this is bad for our kids. We have to create an entire industry of parish-based Catholic schools. And from about 1900 until 1965, they created something like 13,000 of them. So there is always in our history going to be A Nation at Risk, a plenary council of Baltimore, whatever it might be, where people say, we got to do something dramatic. We have to do something at least different. And I think America is big enough and pluralistic enough and liberty is important enough that I try to take that stuff seriously. I always try to maybe turn down the heat on the discussion a bit, but I just don't think that normal politics through local democratic means is the only way you can go about change. I think the power of exit, the power of civil society activity, of social entrepreneurialism, a lot of that stuff is actually quite good. And this is why I've tried to develop a philosophy on like, how do you blend together local democratic control of small institutions where the majority of people trust that body, but you also enable a system where families, whether for idiosyncratic reasons, religious reasons, health reasons, want to have some other kind of option. So blending both a choice and democratic means. I don't have a perfect model for that yet, but I'm much more comfortable with that kind of stuff than I think many are.
I'll just jump in quickly and then turn things back to Jennifer and say, I didn't anticipate that I'd be thinking so much about David Tyack in this conversation. But of course, David Tyack, I think it was the last book that he wrote, was called Seeking Common Ground. And so I think it's no surprise that, a couple of progressive liberals in conversation with a conservative working to try to identify some common ground are generating some of the same kinds of thinking that, I think one of our best scholars in education who was concerned with such matters was himself thinking about towards the end of his life. And one of the things that I'm thinking about that David and I talked a lot about was the importance of reversibility of reforms. And so one thing that I'm thinking about, listening to you, Andy, and thinking about the kinds of reform, and you can't even call them reforms, that are being right now rolled out in state after state to unmake public education, right? Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Indiana, New Hampshire, right? The list goes on. They are totally irreversible in the sense that they would pull apart these elements, these core elements of a system that has taken, not quite 200 years, depends on what state you're in, to build. And so while I see radicalism, as being really essential and really important, I think it's also really important to think about this question of reversibility, and then to think about one other thing, and that's in whose name is this being done? Because I think that a lot of the people in whose name these reforms are being advanced are not actually in favor of them, or if the policies were clearer as to their ultimate consequence, would not be in favor of them. That ultimately these are efforts that, I'll say it again, I don't think are good faith efforts. I think they are efforts to mislead people for the benefit of the few. And insofar as that is the case, right, it's radicalism of a very different sort than the sort of bottom up, radical activity of people trying to liberate themselves, of people bristling against injustice, against people who have been shut out of a system. It's in fact the I'll borrow a phrase from you, the funhouse mirror opposite of that, except where down is up.
Can I just, I would like to know where you guys end up thinking a reform went from level-headed to radical, because over time I've seen this as a continuum. So just give me a minute to do this, and you can tell me at what point you think it goes from reasonable to funhouse mirror. Okay, so for 150 years, we had a system where almost all kids were in district-run schools, and they were assigned by home address, and districts ran virtually all of the schools that they were in control of. So then we had small tweaks to that through chartering and contracting, where the new system said the district doesn't have to run all schools. It can contract or charter with nonprofits to run schools. And then districts added other schools of choice underneath its umbrella. So now, rather than just schools assigned by home address, you had multiple providers, often all nonprofit, but still underneath the aegis of the district. So that's step one. Step two is the state saying, well, not all nonprofit public schools need to be overseen by a district. So you had state authorizers of charter schools, still a government body like a state Department of Education, and it could authorize public schools and oversee them. The next step would be a state saying, well, it doesn't have to be a state body. It could be a nonprofit or a college or university, even a private college or university that oversaw public schools. The next step would be the private school inclusion, that some number of low-income kids have access to a voucher if their school is persistently underperforming, but it's going to be means tested. And then the next step is a little bit more expansive. Rather than being at the poverty line 200% or 300% of the poverty line, then the next step would be a new mechanism like a tuition tax credit, where it's not just a state giving a voucher to a family, it's private citizens giving money to a charitable fund, getting a tax credit so scholarships can go to kids. The next step would be education savings accounts, where the state portion of education funding is put on a card for a family, for example, with special needs kids to get special services, or you could expand beyond special needs kids to others. So what I have seen is this continuum is uniform government monopoly control and assigning kids based on home address. And then you, in serial order, add different providers, different amounts of choice, different levels of accountability, and then different levels of unbundling of the services. And I think the entire continuum is interesting. Obviously, I get a little bit more nervous the further we go out, but I'm wondering, do you guys think that like the break point is once the district no longer runs schools, then we're in a different area, or once it's no longer nonprofits, or once it's no longer district oversight, or once you allow private schools, or once you allow religious schools, or once you get to ESAs, what starts to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up?
So in preparation for this, I brought out my copy of, I don't know if you remember this book, The Urban School System of the Future.
Another genius production. Whose was that?
It was by one Andy Smarick. And look, it says in solidarity. So he does know how to spell that. So because I was sort of curious, like in some ways, the debates that you and I used to have now feel almost quaint to me. And so I looked at the end of your book, and you have this line about how, surely there are options in education between statism and libertarianism, and policymakers should develop them carefully. And I think what's so disturbing about the current moment is how the legislation that we're seeing come down the pike really dismisses that with that entire continuum that you laid out. And so it feels almost like an abstract argument to sort of go back and relitigate. Like, we're not talking about that anymore. Right. I was reading a piece about Indiana's voucher expansion, and they want to expand voucher eligibility to families making $145,000 a year, which is twice the median income in Indiana. And there was a line in the story that I feel like I encounter again and again in reading about this stuff. And that was, the program was originally intended to benefit low income and minority students. Like, that horse has left the barn. And so, now we're going to have figure out a different way to have this debate, because in the midst of the pandemic, right, there is no loud cry for the urban school system of the future, right? Like, no one is saying what we need is a New Orleans. Instead, it's let's empower parents by giving them a percentage of their money, letting them spend however they want it, and freeing them from the legal oversight of things like IDEA. Now, a question from a viewer has popped up. I don't know if you want to pivot and
Sure.
address that.
Before we do that, can I just pile on here and say that
it's so fun
that I think this is a false choice. We could do a counterfactual history here. Of course, that's what the person trained as a historian wants to do, is like, let's do some niche history work. But I think, we could have made a series of different choices that were outside of this neoliberal paradigm, where treating people as consumers, treating education as a market was not the approach. And so I'm not going to say this in a sort of smart alecky way, because this is not a debate, and I really appreciate that it's not a debate. I say this in like a truly genuine way, and that's that I reject the question. because as I really value you, Andy, as somebody who is an intellectual sparring partner. And I think the result of this friction is better than what either of us would come up with on our own. So again, I'm like laying the groundwork for like, this is about common ground, but I reject the premise of the question because I think it presumes a set of assumptions and beliefs that I believe are flawed. And I believe that instead of taking us down that path, that if we fully funded our schools, particularly our schools serving racially marginalized kids and low-income kids, if we worked to integrate our schools, if we actually were thoughtful about state accountability and its benefits and limitations, if we really were oriented around the public good, I think, if we had made a series of different decisions, we wouldn't be where we are now. And I'll just wrap by saying, like, I don't believe that I'm necessarily right. That's just how I see things. And I don't mean that when I say I reject the question, I mean that in the friendliest academic sort of way.
I mean, would it help if I just did like 60 seconds on why I end up thinking in those terms of that question? And
Sure,
it's like a combination of the old Deluder Satan Act of 1647 and the Pierce versus Society of Sisters decision 1925 and the experience of other countries, other Western nations, and the Catholic schools experience, which is, it seems to me that our constitutional and legal structure and the history of state legislation and the language of state constitutions all lead me to believe that the state government needs to make sure that kids are educated. But it doesn't say that the state has to do a certain model of education delivery, except in a couple cases related to like post-Brown and like district power stuff. But in most cases, it's the state must provide for fair and equitable. There are different adjectives involved there. But it gives the state wide leeway in what kind of system of public education there is. Now, for historical reasons, because districts often predated those constitutional provisions, states defaulted to the delivery of public education. Though it's a state-level obligation, it will be actualized at the district level. But we know because of the Pierce decision that the state can't force kids to go to a certain type of school. And we know that there are thousands of private schools around. And we know, going back to the Deluder Satan Act, that initially Massachusetts was saying all kids got to learn how to read, but that doesn't mean Massachusetts created schools. So the point of all of this is, it seems to me that American history tells us that there will always be a set of schools that exist outside of the public government system, and that's legitimate. It's protected by the Constitution. Families will want to access those schools for a variety of reasons: faith, history, tradition, race, whatever it might be. And the state government has to make sure that kids are educated, but it doesn't have to run all schools. So when I put those things together, I start to think, how do we simultaneously do local democratic control and provision of public education and respect the private sector and respect parental agency and social entrepreneurialism? And I just don't see the way out of that, like respecting pluralism, democracy, social entrepreneurialism, diversity of choice, and so on.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think that's really thoughtful. I think that's a really interesting line of discussion. If Schenker wants to invite, us, Jennifer is looking like she wants no part of this future conversation. If Schenker wants to invite us to talk about like what choice should be and what districts should, who should deliver schooling, I would welcome that. I think that probably the two of us could agree on a lot, but I know Jennifer well enough that she's like, there are 4 questions in the Q&A. Can we please stop being in the weeds on the, like, Andy, if Andy says old Deluder Satan Act one more time, she's going to go to sleep. So
No,
Jennifer,
actually,
what do you want us to do?
It's from Massachusetts.
I
know.
No, I was thinking how, because of my partnership with Jack and our work on the podcast together, I've become kind of obsessed with education history. And you do like seeing this tension play out. And so, for example, when Virginia shuts down its schools, and you have this after Brown v. Board, and you have this big debate about private schools, and you see there's this discomfort among people, like, are we really gonna use taxpayer dollars to pay for schools that discriminate? Are we really going to do that? And so I think all of your questions are really interesting, Andy, but playing out for me in the background as you're talking is a whole list of Supreme Court cases, that recent Supreme Court cases and ones that are coming down the pike. And those would be the ones that are kind of, well, like rethinking the divide between church and state, and saying not only that we're okay now with taxpayer money going to religious institutions, but that if you deny religious institutions that money, that in itself is discriminatory. And so I'm thinking of, cases like the private school in Maryland, where you are, where, yep, they want to be in the voucher program, but they still want to be able to deny entrance to gay kids, because to not deny entrance to gay kids is a violation of their free speech. Right? There are actually a whole bunch of big cases like this. And so I feel like we have to take your interesting questions about pluralism and once again hold them up to the harsh light that is our current debate. So we do have a couple of questions, and one of them is about democracy, which we've talked a little bit about. And Andy, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Sternleib, he's a supporter of public schools, but he thinks that it's a myth that public schools reflect democratic process. School boards are deeply flawed. And one way we know this is that participation in them, they only attract 6 to 10% of voters. And actually, Andy, I'm curious about what you think, because this seems like an issue where you've been so close to these bodies. So maybe you don't want to just junk them, but on the other hand, talk about an imperfect vehicle.
Like everything in democracy, what did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst of all forms of government,
except for
other
every
than
other one.
Everything else that's ever been tried. So yeah, I mean, often you go to a school board meeting and you can just shake your head at the kind of debates they're having. But listen, they're democratically elected, they're democratically legitimate. They are dealing with budget issues, they're dealing with staffing, personnel issues, and we have the ability to kick members off after a couple years. They don't. It's sausage making when you get to watch what they're doing, but they do have this virtue often in America. I mean, often people think about like school districts as being New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, 400, 500, 600,000 kids. I think the average school district has like 7 schools. And probably that's distorted on the high end by the outlier. So I bet the median school district in America has 5, 6 schools. Not, a million kids like New York City. So these are hyper local bodies, and often they do reflect their communities, and they get stuff wrong, no doubt. And this is one of the questions I had. Maybe we can explore some other time. But it made me think in your book about accountability. Like there's one way of thinking about accountability, which is districts should run the schools in a geographic area. If you want accountability, you just go through your school board. I'm nervous about that because I think the pre-NCLB era taught us there can be big differences between districts, and a district might not be serving all of its kids well. There probably should be some other external accountability that could be brought about by school choice, by a state technocratic system, by the thing that I think you guys really don't like, which is sort of this Yelp style, like crowdsourcing. But it does raise a really interesting question that I don't have the right answer to, which is, if you have part democratic school system by assignment and part choice, what is the right way to understand whether or not the schools are doing what we need them to do? And it's probably an inelegant answer, like a combination of democratic control and technocratic systems and school choice, I think.
Because I get nervous about this as a teacher, I always worry when people have asked questions and they got ignored. So I'm going to play lightning round here, and Andy and Jennifer, you can do whatever you want. So just lightning, the 4 questions. What role should teachers play? I think teachers should be intimately involved in the making of policy, and the fact that they haven't been reflects our gendered society as well as our notions about social class and prestige, and it's been to the detriment of our schools. I think that Bernie Bond has asked a question that I can't answer in the lightning round, but the tension between local and state is a really productive one if we actually think through it. And the problem is that we've totally neutered local democratic practices to the extent that turnout for local school board elections is often in single digits. Anonymous attendee who wants it in the reverse order, I'll just say the book is organized into 3 parts. The first is the ideology behind the unmaking of public education. The second is the policies that are advancing that agenda. And then the third part is the very scary future that Jennifer and I referred to while writing the book as the Black Mirror section of the book that we have to look forward to if these policies are advanced. And then have you heard guest, Andrea Gabor, author of a great book that everybody should buy, asked about how concerned we are. And I know I speak for Jennifer when I say we're hugely concerned about declining state revenues and the threat that that poses. It will really make schools and public education in general vulnerable to these sorts of unmaking efforts. That was my lightning round. I'm going to mute until we're done.
I love that you just took the lightning round hostage and asked all the questions, answered all the questions.
Yep. And now you can do whatever you want. You can,
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my world.
You can answer them too.
So there's another question that popped up. Is having so many school districts not a problem in and of itself? Boy, are we seeing this right now with the reopening debate. Jack and I are in Massachusetts, where things are playing out like they are everywhere, which is basically that the state has punted decision-making down to the local level, and it's being fought out district by district. And you really see the weaknesses of that. And it, it gets at the heart of the issue that Andy raised, that on the one hand, you have this kind of local democratic process, flawed as it is, but, we would really benefit from some, actual leadership at this point.
I mean, I agree with most of what both of you have said. I mean, this question about the pandemic year consumes a whole bunch of my thinking, because this could go in a whole lot of different directions, and I just don't know which. And I keep consuming every bit of public opinion data that I can. Like, how are African Americans seeing the pandemic differently than white families or wealthy families or red district families? And the fact that a lot of families are so not eager to send their kids back and are somewhat pleased, satisfied with what their districts are doing. But also we have seen the increase in pods, and we have seen Catholic schools be able to get open more quickly. And a lot of families seem quite happy with that. So I just don't know what the backside of the pandemic looks like, whether we're going to see much more homeschooling, much more online, much more podding, or if things go back to normal. My only prediction or analysis would be, I don't think in any of our lifetimes we've seen this kind of potential for disequilibrium, where things have been so stable for so long, and then for a year it's like we shook up the snow globe. And what are people's minds going to be like once, everything gets to settle? Are there going to be a whole bunch of suburban families who decide, online wasn't all that bad, or maybe we could do a pod? Or does everyone say, oof, happy that's behind us? Public opinion data, I will say, has surprised me in that I thought more people would be frustrated with this year and more willing to do dramatic things differently. And the lack of anger at unions, the happiness about district performance, about hesitancy about going back full time, seems that there is something about the stability of the system, at least as the public opinion is saying at this moment.
We didn't even get to talk about unions. I have so many opinions.
Next time.
If they ever have us back.
Thank you guys so much. You made my job of doing the Q&A so easy, because you did it yourself. And you got to a lot of them. We had so many questions at the end, and we are a little over time already. I would like to give a few minutes to Jennifer and Jack to do any final takeaways that you would like people to walk away with, any final thoughts that you think you didn't cover but are very important in the book, and any final remarks that you want to do. Take about a minute each, and then we'll wrap up.
Go ahead, Jack.
Sure. I'll just take the opportunity to say that I think substantive disagreement, when it is hashed out with thoughtful people, and where we can agree that our goal is not to throw mud, but rather to try to work out our differences, that's been something that I've been interested in for a really long time. In fact, I ran an EdWeek blog for a couple of years that started with that effort, trying to bridge differences with Michelle Rhee. And Andy was a guest there. That's how Andy and I met. So I would just encourage people to find ways to be in dialogue with people, because that's ultimately the thing that I think our schools do best when they do it, is teach us how to have conversations across difference. That's why I think public education is so essential to democracy. And so, if you are listening to this and you just disagree with me and Jennifer, invite us to come to your book circle, your coffee clatch, and we'll come have an interesting and lively discussion with you.
And I would just add that back in the day, Andy Smarick and I attempted a podcast together, and I have those tapes. They are available to the highest bidder. See, Andy, I don't hate capitalism.
I might have to bid.
So one of the things that's been really cool about doing, like, people reading the book and then getting a chance to talk to them, is that a lot of the reaction has been similar to yours, Andy, and which is to say that people will say, I really believe in public education, but man, is it messed up. I want to, would you come and do a book group with us so we can work through some of this stuff? And I feel like, we're leaping at that opportunity, right? Because it forces us to examine exactly what you were talking about. What are our core principles? And, we're going to be hearing from people who feel really strongly that the traditional delivery system, as you call it, is too flawed to be of use anymore. And that our scathing indictment of something like personalization is way too broad, right? We need to customize our indictment. I encourage people to read the book and tell us what you think and challenge us with your disagreements, because the conversation is turning out to be really fruitful.
Well, go ahead.
Okay, I just add 10 seconds of something. This
course.
is just like an Uber issue, which is Uber not being
like
the gig
you're
thing.
Waiting for a car?
No, back before it became a service, which is, this has been so delightful for me to actually have to think through issues and knowing that I was going to engage with people who are so smart but differ on fundamentals that I do. I've just noticed, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong about this, it seems like over the past 5, maybe 10 years, there's a whole lot less of what we're doing than there used to be. I used to expect when I went to a panel, heard a panel, that there would be people of radically different views, and that they would, hash things out in a civil way. Increasingly, when I see panel discussions, it's 3 people of different shades of the same set of beliefs. It's almost like we, as a community, the policy advocacy thinking community, we've lost the ability to have civil discussions. So the more of these that we can do generally, I think is good for all of us. And I just think we need to get that back into the ethic of how we think about policy and advocacy. So thank you to the Schenker Institute is what I'm trying to say.
And thank you guys for such a terrific conversation. I want to remind people to get the book. It's great. And to also, as they said before, they do discuss many of these ideas in the Have You Heard podcast. I'm a huge fan and I recommend you subscribe. And the video will be posted at the Albert Schenker Institute website, so you can view it, share it, and enjoy it. I've very much enjoyed having you guys on, and I look forward to next time. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us and for your great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.